The sea is black and soundless. Only the faint churn of propellers stirs the water. A Japanese convoy bound for Formosa, 1944. 30 merchant ships crawl through the darkness, ringed by destroyers with depth charges primed. Above them, the Empire's last lifeline pulses through these hulls. Oil, rice, iron ore. The veins of a dying war machine. Deep beneath, silence hums with intent. Inside the American submarine USS Sea Lion 12, red lights paint the narrow steel walls. Sweat drips down the faces of men who haven't seen daylight in weeks. Every sound matters. The hiss of oxygen, the scrape of a boot. Commander Eli Reich leans over the periscope, voice low, calm, deliberate. Range. 3,200 yards. Target, troop transport. Fire when ready. The torpedo room crew waits. Then, whoosh! 1, 2, 3, silver fish slip into the black. Seconds stretch like wire. Then, impact. A blinding orange bloom erupts from the surface. Another ship follows. Steel screams, bulkheads buckle, men leap into fire. The sea becomes a graveyard lit by gasoline. Japanese sailors cry out over the radio waves, "Enemy submarine!" Port side. But no direction, no coordinates, only panic. On Sea Lion 2, the sonar operator whispers, "2 hits confirmed." She's breaking up. Reich lowers the periscope. Mark it. Convoy destroyed. Above, the Imperial flag still flutters, tattered and burning. It was once the symbol of a navy that ruled the Pacific. The same force that had swept across the ocean like a storm, sinking fleets, seizing islands, humbling empires. The Japanese believed their navy was divine, forged by Yamato steel, guided by the spirit of Bushido. But beneath that faith, a silent enemy had been growing. An unseen arm of the U.S. Navy, fewer than 200 submarines, was rewriting the war in silence. By 1945, these silent service boats would sink over 2,300 Japanese vessels, including more than 200 warships and 8 million tons of merchant shipping. Japan's sea lanes would vanish. Its factories would starve. Its navy, once the most powerful in Asia, would die not in great battles, but in pieces, beneath the waves. The myth of the untouchable Imperial Navy would not end with the roar of aircraft at Midway. It would end here, in the darkness, with the quiet hiss of a torpedo tube and the long silence that followed. In the first year of the Pacific War, the American submarine force was fighting blind. Torpedoes misfired, sonar was crude, and Washington's strategy was paralyzed by bureaucracy. Submarine captains returned from patrols furious, claiming direct hits that yielded nothing but geysers of seawater. The weapon meant to deliver vengeance was broken. That weapon was the Mark 14 torpedo, paired with the Mark 6 magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel. In theory, it was a masterpiece of engineering. In practice, it was a disaster. It ran too deep, its triggers were faulty, and its magnetic sensors detonated prematurely. For the first 18 months of the war, nearly 70% of torpedoes either failed to explode or missed entirely. Submarine crews called it a dud fleet. Commanders like Charles Swede Mommsen and Dudley "Mush" Morton protested bitterly, but the Bureau of Ordnance refused to admit fault. It took field evidence, torpedoes recovered from the sea, tests conducted in secret, to expose the truth. When the fix came, it changed everything. By late 1943, the Mark 14's flaws were corrected. Now the submarines could finally do what they'd been built for: sever Japan's arteries. The Pacific was vast, over 60 million square miles, but to the U.S. Navy's silent service, it became a map of targets. Submarines operated alone, sometimes for months, guided by radio silence and instinct. Their world was pressure, darkness, and nerve. Each patrol was a gamble with death. One leak, one sonar ping, and the boat could become a steel coffin. Their mission was simple but total. Sink everything that floats. Unrestricted submarine warfare, once a taboo, was now official American policy. The order came directly after Pearl Harbor, signed by Chief of Naval Operations Harold Stark on December 7, 1941, only hours after the attack. It mirrored Germany's U-boat campaign, but with one crucial difference. The Pacific was a single nation's lifeline. Japan imported over 90% of its oil, 80% of its steel, and half its food by sea. Each ship that vanished meant one fewer tank, one darker city, one starving family. At first, results came slowly. U.S. submarines were outnumbered, their bases primitive, their commanders cautious. But as new leaders emerged, men like Mush Morton, USS Wahoo, Etintifif, USTD Kufanth, Eugene Fluckey, USS Barb, Richard O'Kane, USS Tang, and Eli Reich, USS Celian II, tactics evolved. They began to hunt not defensively, but aggressively, striking convoys at night, using radar to track and ambush targets, attacking in wolf packs inspired by the German model. And behind them, the U.S. industrial engine roared to life. By 1944, American shipyards were producing a new breed, the Gato-class and Balao-class submarines. Faster, tougher, able to dive to 400 feet and carry 24 torpedoes. Each was a mobile fortress of steel, radar, and sonar. Japan, by contrast, remained trapped in its own doctrine. The Imperial Navy's submarine fleet, over 100 boats, was used not to attack commerce, but to scout and engage warships. They sank a few cruisers and carriers but failed to touch the flow of American supplies. To Japan's admirals, commerce raiding was cowardly, unworthy of the warrior spirit. It was a fatal blindness. As U.S. submarines grew more lethal, Japan's response lagged. Its escort destroyers were too few, its sonar obsolete, its radar scarce. Merchant convoys were organized late and protected poorly. By 1944, Japan's entire anti-submarine force numbered fewer than 50 effective escort vessels to defend a supply network spanning 4,000 miles. The result was mathematical annihilation. One by one, the empire's trade routes vanished. Tankers to Borneo stopped coming home. Coal shipments from Korea fell by half. Even military transport became suicide. By early 1945, U.S. submarines were sinking Japanese ships faster than Japan could build them, at a ratio of nearly 10 to 1. And still, most of these battles went unseen. No great naval duels, no headlines, just silence, sonar pings, and explosions in the night. In Tokyo, the admirals still plotted grand fleet engagements: Yamato, Musashi, Midway, Leyte. Unaware that their empire was already bleeding to death below the surface, the hunters had become the ocean itself. The convoy burns. The camera lingers on the drifting wreckage. A life jacket marked with kanji, a floating crate of rice, an oil slick stretching to the horizon, fade to black. For the Japanese Empire, the sea was destiny. An island nation with scarce natural resources, Japan's power, its food, fuel, and future all came by water. Control the ocean, and the empire lived. Lose it, and it starved. At the dawn of the Second World War, Japan's admirals believed they had mastered that equation. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the Kaigun, was the pride of Asia, the second most powerful navy in the world after Britain's. Its ships were sleek, precise, and devastating. By 1941, the Japanese fleet possessed 10 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 18 heavy cruisers, and over 100 destroyers. At its heart stood the colossal Yamato-class battleships, each mounting 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell the weight of a small car more than 25 miles. To many in Japan, they were floating cathedrals, symbols of divine national strength. Its naval officers were not merely soldiers. They were priests of the sea. Theirs was a creed born from centuries of isolation and forged in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan had stunned the world by destroying Russia's fleet at Tsushima in 1905. The message burned into their doctrine. The Japanese sailor was unmatched, the emperor's navy untouchable. And for a time, that belief seemed justified. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers swept out of the Pacific mist toward Pearl Harbor. In 2 hours, they sank or crippled 8 American battleships and killed more than 2,400 men. The rising sun flag fluttered over the Pacific. Manila fell. Singapore, Britain's fortress in Asia, collapsed in weeks. The Imperial Navy struck with precision, coordination, and ruthlessness the world had never seen. The Western powers reeled. The Pacific, once thought an American lake, became a Japanese empire stretching from Burma to the Aleutians. And behind that expansion stood one unspoken assumption, that Japan's sea lanes were safe. They were not. Beneath the surface of those vast waters moved a fleet of smaller, unseen vessels. The United States had entered the war with just 111 operational submarines, most designed in the 1930s. They were cramped, unreliable, and armed with torpedoes that often failed to detonate. Few believed they could make a difference. Even the U.S. Navy saw submarines mainly as scouts, not as the sword of a campaign. But in 1942, as Japan's empire spread across the Pacific, those submarines began to hunt. They targeted what Japan could not replace, its merchant fleet. The empire's strength relied on an oceanic lifeline. Ships carrying oil from Borneo, coal from Korea, rubber from Malaya, and food from Indochina. It was a network stretching 3,000 miles, feeding an industrial beast already straining under war. And it was almost undefended. Japan had focused everything on great fleet battles, on Yamato's guns, not on convoys. Anti-submarine warfare was dismissed as defensive and dishonorable, the work of lesser men. Escorts were few, sonar was primitive, convoy coordination was clumsy. The stage was set for a silent war. As 1942 turned into 1943, American submarines began to operate aggressively across the South China Sea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Philippine routes. Every month, more Japanese tonnage disappeared beneath the waves. At first, Tokyo ignored the losses. Reports were vague, censored, or dismissed. How could an enemy they barely saw be winning? But soon, the numbers became undeniable. By mid-1943, Japan had lost nearly 1.5 million tons of merchant shipping. Factories in Nagoya and Osaka began to run dry. Fuel reserves dwindled. The Imperial Navy, designed for decisive battle, found itself stranded, forced to conserve oil, even as the Americans built more carriers and destroyers than Japan could ever hope to match. And still, the belief in invincibility held. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had once warned, "I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success." He was right. By the time his plane was shot down in 1943, Japan's fate was already sinking, slowly, invisibly, like a torpedoed freighter slipping beneath the Black Pacific. From the first days of its modern navy, Japan believed in one idea above all others: the Kantai Kessen, or decisive battle doctrine. It was more than a plan. It was dogma. The doctrine was born from Admiral Sato Tetsutaro's writings in the early 1900s and hardened after the 1905 victory at Tsushima Strait. There, Admiral Togo Heihachiro had crushed the Russian fleet in a single day. The perfect annihilation. From that moment, Japan's naval leadership believed that wars at sea would always be decided in one great engagement, a clash of fleets, battleships against battleships, where skill and courage would determine destiny. Every generation of officers was trained for that moment. Every ship was built for it. Every tactic, every exercise assumed it would come. So when the Pacific War began, Japan's admirals were not thinking of logistics, attrition, or trade routes. They were waiting for their second Tsushima, a single, thunderous victory that would force America to the negotiating table. Their strategy was meticulous, almost elegant on paper. Lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet westward with early conquests, weaken it through attritional strikes by submarines and aircraft, deliver the killing blow in a massive surface engagement, the decisive battle. Somewhere in the Philippine Sea, it was a plan for spectacle and honor, not survival. And it demanded an enemy willing to play by the same rules. The United States refused. Instead of rushing into Japan's trap, Admiral Chester Nimitz and Admiral Ernest King waged war by distance, cutting across the Central Pacific step by step, island by island, using superior air power and industrial strength. They bypassed strongholds, isolated garrisons, and, crucially, turned the war into one of logistics. In this new kind of war, ships mattered less than what they carried. Oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, iron from China, food from Indochina. These were Japan's real weapons, and they moved on slow, unprotected hulls. Yet Tokyo barely noticed their disappearance. The Imperial Navy's obsession with a decisive fleet battle consumed its budget, its training, and its imagination. Merchant defense was a neglected afterthought. By 1942, Japan had less than one-tenth the escort tonnage of the Allies. There was no central convoy command, no system for rerouting traffic, no mass production of escort ships or aircraft. Even as losses mounted, naval staff officers dismissed them as temporary setbacks. They told the emperor that the enemy's submarines cannot endure long-range warfare. But the enemy didn't need endurance. It needed patience. Below the waves, American submariners were dismantling Japan's strategy one convoy at a time. They didn't seek glory or decisive battle. They sought silence, a victory of arithmetic. Each merchant ship that sank did more damage to Japan's war effort than any carrier battle. Each missing tanker drained the Yamato's engines and darkened Tokyo's lights. By late 1943, Japan's fleet could no longer refuel fully. Entire squadrons were immobilized. Pilots trained in simulators because there was no aviation gasoline to spare. The decisive battle was approaching, but Japan was running out of means to fight it. And yet, faith in the doctrine persisted. Admirals clung to their charts, awaiting the great encounter that would redeem the empire. They didn't see that it had already begun. Not with thunder, but with the quiet hiss of a torpedo. While Japanese admirals clung to visions of a decisive battle, the United States quietly drafted a different kind of war. One waged by mathematics, technology, and patience. In early 1942, the U.S. Navy's Submarine Force Pacific, SubPac, was in disarray. Commanders complained of useless torpedoes, timid patrol orders, and a system that prized caution over destruction. Some returned from entire patrols without a single confirmed kill. Washington, still haunted by pre-war notions of civilized naval conduct, had forbidden attacks on passenger or neutral vessels. But Pearl Harbor changed everything. The attack did not just sink battleships. It shattered illusions. The Navy that had trained for surface combat now had no surface fleet left to fight with. The battleships lay in mud. The carriers were far away. And so the war beneath the sea began almost by necessity. At first, it was chaos. Submarine captains operated independently, with little intelligence, few working torpedoes, and no coherent doctrine. Some commanders, bound by old caution, avoided risk. Others attacked boldly but blindly. The results were uneven. moments of brilliance swallowed by months of frustration. Then, in 1943, a change of command altered everything. Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, appointed head of Subpac, brought order to the chaos. He demanded results, accountability, and, above all, belief in the submariners themselves. If the Mark 14 torpedo is a failure, he told his staff, then it's our duty to prove it, not to excuse it. Lockwood forced the Bureau of Ordnance to face the truth. Live fire tests in Hawaiian waters revealed the scandal. Depth control errors, faulty detonators, defective magnetic pistols. Under Lockwood's orders, engineers stripped, rewired, and rebuilt the torpedoes from scratch. Within months, the fleet's most hated weapon became its deadliest. Now, every patrol mattered. Lockwood restructured Subpac's operations into coordinated patrol zones, assigning groups of submarines to specific sea lanes: the South China Sea, Luzon Strait, East China Sea, and Bungo Swedo. Each zone was chosen for one reason. It was where Japan's lifelines converged. Intelligence also began to flow. U.S. codebreakers at Pearl Harbor Station, HIPO, were decrypting Japanese naval communications, allowing Lockwood to track convoy routes in near real time. The submariners, once blind, now hunted with purpose. By late 1943, Lockwood formalized the new doctrine: seek shipping lanes, not warships. Attack at night, using radar tracking. Use coordinated wolf packs, 3 or more submarines working together, trapping convoys from multiple angles. The results were catastrophic. For Japan. In 1944 alone, U.S. submarines sank 2.7 million tons of Japanese shipping, nearly half of the empire's merchant fleet. Convoys were obliterated in the South China Sea. Oil tankers never reached home. Even warships, when caught, were doomed. The Japanese response was desperate and disjointed. Their sonar technology lagged years behind. Radar was virtually absent. Escort tactics were primitive, often sailing in tight circles or dropping depth charges at random. The Imperial Navy's doctrine still saw submarines as auxiliary scouts, not a national threat. And while the U.S. built over 200 new submarines, Japan could barely replace the ships it lost. This asymmetry was not just industrial. It was conceptual. America had embraced war as a system: logistics, code-breaking, production, and technology working in harmony. Japan still fought as an art, relying on spirit and courage to fill the gaps that science and planning had left. By 1944, the results spoke in tonnage. Each American submarine averaged nearly 50,000 tons of enemy shipping destroyed per year, an efficiency unmatched in any navy. Submarine losses were high but acceptable. 52 boats sunk, 3,500 men lost. For that price, Japan's economy was shattered. The plan had become inversion itself. The United States fought a war Japan had not prepared for. Japan fought a war that no longer existed. By the end of 1944, the decisive battle doctrine was a ghost. The Imperial Navy's mightiest ships, Yamato, Musashi, Shinano, could barely move for lack of fuel. Their sailors waited for an enemy they could no longer reach. And beneath them, unseen and unstoppable, America's submarines continued their quiet arithmetic. One ship at a time. The sea, once a sanctuary for the rising sun, had turned into a graveyard. By mid-1944, every Japanese convoy that left port did so under a sentence of death. The waters of the South China Sea were now the most dangerous in the world. Every few days, the American submarines of Subpac, operating from Fremantle, Pearl Harbor, and Midway, fanned out across its lanes like wolves scenting prey. Their steel hulls slid silently through tropical thermoclines, sonar pings echoing faintly across the abyss. One of them was the USS Tang, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Richard O'Kane, small, lean, relentless. O'Kane's doctrine was simple: attack first, attack close, and never miss. He hunted convoys at night, charging in on the surface under radar guidance, firing at point-blank range. On June 10, 1944, O'Kane found one of Japan's largest troop convoys off the coast of Formosa. 10 freighters escorted by destroyers. The Tang closed to within 900 yards and fired 6 torpedoes. 4 hit. 2 transports erupted in columns of flame. A third broke in half. The sea boiled with burning oil and drowning men. The escorts counterattacked furiously, dropping more than 100 depth charges. But the Tang was gone, silent and deep, gliding beneath the shattered convoy she had just destroyed. By dawn, over 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were dead. It was a massacre without witness, yet its effect rippled through the Empire's veins. Another route to the Philippines was severed. That same summer, Admiral Lockwood unleashed a new weapon: coordinated wolf packs. In July, 3 submarines, Celian II, Growler, and Pampanito, formed the first of these lethal triads, nicknamed Abe's Abattoir. Their mission: hunt the convoys supplying the Philippines. On September 12, 1944, near Luzon Strait, radar contact flickered across Celian II's scope. A massive formation, 14 ships, 8 escorts. The American subs moved into position like predators closing a ring. At 03 darns, they attacked simultaneously. Torpedoes streaked through the dark like shooting stars beneath the waves. One after another, Japanese ships erupted. Ammunition freighters, troop transports, tankers. The largest, Rakuyo Maru, carrying over 1,000 Allied prisoners of war, was among them. A tragedy that would later haunt the Victory. By morning, the convoy was gone. Out of 14 ships, 8 were destroyed, the rest limping away aflame. The Celian II surfaced hours later to rescue survivors, among them 73 Allied POWs, as oil and wreckage drifted for miles. In Tokyo, shock turned to disbelief. Convoy commanders reported losses of over 50% per voyage. Some captains refused to sail at all. The Imperial Navy, once obsessed with facing enemy fleets, now faced a far crueler truth. Its enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Meanwhile, Japan's merchant tonnage plummeted. In 1941, the Empire had possessed nearly 6 million tons of shipping. By the end of 1944, less than 2 million remained. Factories closed for lack of fuel. Trains ran on wood. Fishermen starved as diesel vanished. Even rice shipments from Southeast Asia could no longer reach Japan's shores. And still the submarines hunted. Far to the east, the USS Barb, under Commander Eugene Fluckey, redefined audacity. In January 1945, Fluckey's crew penetrated Namquan Harbor on the coast of China, one of Japan's most heavily defended anchorages. Under the cover of darkness, they fired torpedoes at anchor, then turned at full speed to escape exploding ships and shore batteries. 8 Japanese vessels were sunk in less than 15 minutes. Not a single American casualty. Fluckey later wrote in his patrol log, "The entire harbor is a mass of flames. How I wish we could remain and watch the fireworks. But we are low on torpedoes, and the fireworks are getting too close." His raid earned him the Medal of Honor. But more than that, it broke the myth of Japanese safety. No port, no convoy, no sea lane was beyond the reach of the silent service. In Tokyo's naval staff rooms, maps of the Pacific grew darker with each loss. Supply lines once drawn in confident red were now crossed out, replaced with silence. The Empire was bleeding invisibly, its death recorded not in great battles, but in daily reports. Convoy number 123 failed to arrive. Tanker Hokutai Maru, presumed lost. No survivors. The once proud fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor was now chained to empty docks, awaiting orders it could not fulfill. Japan's war machine had been designed for thunder. Instead, it was dying in whispers, and the silence was about to deepen. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy still boasted some of the largest and most heavily armed ships ever built. Floating fortresses like Taiho, Shinano, and Musashi. Each symbolized Japan's faith in naval supremacy, each built on the assumption that armor and honor could outlast technology. But the war had changed, and the ocean no longer obeyed their gods. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the brand-new carrier Taiho, pride of the Imperial Navy, led Japan's strike force. She was a marvel, Japan's first armored deck carrier, carrying nearly 70 aircraft and protected by steel thicker than any before her. Admirals believed her unsinkable. At 08:10, USS Albacore found her. Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard fired a spread of 6 torpedoes from 2,000 yards. Only one struck, a single hit on the starboard side, near the aviation fuel tanks. At first, it seemed minor. Taiho continued flight operations. Her decks buzzed with aircraft, but deep inside, fuel vapors leaked through the ship's ventilation. Hours later, an aviation mechanic switched on a compressor motor. The spark ignited a firestorm. At 14:32, Taiho's armored flight deck lifted like a lid. The explosion was seen 50 miles away. Of her crew of 2,150, more than 1,600 perished. For the Imperial Navy, it was more than the loss of a ship. It was the loss of faith. A single submarine, with a single torpedo, had destroyed what Japan's admirals called the Invincible Ark. 4 months later came Leyte Gulf, October 1944, the largest naval battle in history. At its center sailed the Yamato-class battleships, Yamato and Musashi, each 72,000 tons of steel and pride, their guns larger than any the world had ever built. The Japanese called them the Spirit of Yamato. The Americans called them floating targets. On October 24th, waves of U.S. carrier aircraft, hundreds strong, swarmed over the Sibuyan Sea. Torpedoes and bombs rained down. Musashi fought back, her 18-inch guns firing into the sky, her crew blinded by flame and smoke. By dusk, she was dead in the water. Torpedoes from USS Darter and USS Dace had crippled her escorts. American aircraft finished the job. At 19:30, Musashi rolled to port and capsized, taking 1,017. 23 men with her. The loss went beyond material. The Yamato class was Japan's heart, an idea that sheer will and size could defy the industrial might of America. When Musashi sank, that myth sank with her. But the most haunting symbol of Japan's undoing came just a month later. Shinano, the largest aircraft carrier ever built, was designed in secret from the third hull of a Yamato-class battleship. She was meant to carry aircraft and repair them at sea. Japan's answer to America's endless production line. Launched in November 1944, she sailed on her maiden voyage untested, her watertight doors unfinished, her crew untrained. The Empire's hope and its desperation were welded into her hull. On the night of November 28, 1944, as Shinano slipped south from Yokosuka under escort, USS Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph Enright, detected her on radar. Enright trailed silently for 6 hours, waiting for the perfect shot. At 03:15 a.m., from 1,400 yards, he fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck home. The great ship shuddered. Water poured through half-sealed hatches. Admirals aboard refused to believe she could sink. They ordered pumps, counter-flooding, anything but evacuation. But the list grew worse. At 10:48 a.m., after 7 hours of agony, Shinano rolled and disappeared beneath the waves. She had been afloat for just 10 days. Of her 2,400 crew, over 1,400 were lost. A single submarine had sunk the largest carrier ever built, without the ship ever firing a shot in anger. By early 1945, the Imperial Navy existed mostly on paper. The decisive battle it had long sought never came. Instead, the fleet's proud hulls rusted at anchor, starved of oil. Even Yamato, the last symbol of defiance, would soon be ordered on a suicide run toward Okinawa, a mission so hopeless that its sailors called it Operation Tengo, Heaven Number 10. As it left port, Yamato carried only enough fuel for a one-way voyage. No return was expected. Submarines shadowed her movements. When she was finally destroyed by American aircraft on April 7, 1945, the explosion shook the sea for miles. The last roar of the Imperial Navy echoed, then vanished into silence. The Empire had built its power upon the sea. Now the sea itself had turned against it. The camera pans downward, beneath the wreckage, where the coral grows around broken propellers and twisted steel. Thousands of men sleep there, still in their duty stations, their ships now tombs. In less than 3 years, American submarines had destroyed 55% of Japan's merchant fleet, 214 warships, and over 8 million tons of shipping. Japan's arteries were cut, its navy was gone, and for the first time in its history, the island nation faced the one fate it had never imagined: isolation. By 1945, Japan's empire still stretched across maps, but only on paper. In reality, the sea that had once fed it had turned hostile. Merchant ships were gone, tankers gone, fishing fleets gone. The U.S. submarines, fewer than 2% of America's naval strength, had achieved what entire armies could not. They had starved a nation of 70 million. Every Japanese port became a graveyard of twisted steel. In Tokyo Bay, shattered freighters lay half-submerged, their hulls pierced by torpedoes, their decks caked in oil. Rust spread like rot through the empire's arteries. By mid-1945, Japan's shipping losses exceeded 8.4 million tons. Its merchant fleet, once among the largest in Asia, was reduced to less than a tenth of its pre-war capacity. The Imperial Navy, once numbering over 1,000 vessels, could no longer leave harbor. The survivors of Yamato's final voyage told of sitting in port, watching fuel reserves so low that training exercises were canceled, entire ships dismantled for scrap, aviation fuel rationed to a single liter per pilot. Japan had built its war machine on imported oil. When the submarines cut those lifelines, the machine simply stopped. By late 1944, rationing had turned into famine. Rice shipments from Burma and Indochina never arrived. Coal from Manchuria lay stranded in harbors. The fishing fleet, once Japan's lifeblood, was paralyzed by lack of diesel. Civilians boiled bark, grass, and acorns. In Tokyo, black markets thrived beside bomb shelters. Hospitals ran without power. Trains sat silent for lack of fuel. School children dug gardens between ruins. The Japanese government called it the transport crisis, but that phrase hid the truth. The empire was starving to death. American submarines didn't just sink ships. They sank the illusion that Japan could feed itself, fight, and sustain an empire across the Pacific. Each missing freighter meant darkness in cities, silence in factories, hunger in homes. For the men of the Imperial Navy, the end came in silence. Submarine warfare gave no warning, no duel, no chance for courage. Ships vanished without trace. Entire convoys failed to report in. Families received no bodies, no graves, only telegrams stamped with the same 4 words: presumed lost at sea. More than 30,000 Japanese sailors died from submarine attacks. Many were civilians, merchant seamen, cooks, fishermen, men who had never seen battle. The ocean became their coffin. For those who survived, memory was a burden. One sailor later recalled, "You never saw the enemy. You never fired a shot. One moment you were drinking tea. The next you were in the water, and everyone you knew was gone." In the final months of the war, survivors clung to driftwood and oil drums, drifting among the wreckage of their own empire. American submarines sometimes surfaced to rescue Allied prisoners from sinking transports, but Japanese sailors were rarely saved. There was simply no room, no time, no mercy left in that sea. The silent service paid heavily, too. Of the 208 American submarines that served in the Pacific, 52 were lost, a casualty rate of almost 20%, the highest of any branch of the U.S. Navy. Each carried 70 to 80 men. None came home, yet the sailors who survived returned to a world that barely knew what they had done. Their war had no grand battles, no victory parades. Their triumph was measured in tonnage and silence. Commander Richard O'Kane, who sank more ships than any other submarine officer, said it simply, "We fought a war in the dark. When it was over, no one saw our victories. Only the peace that followed." That peace had been bought with steel, fire, and starvation. Japan's surrender would come months later, but its defeat had already been sealed beneath the sea. The empire that had once believed itself born of the ocean had been betrayed by it. The Pacific, vast, eternal, merciless, had chosen new masters. In the summer of 1945, Japan's admirals gathered in a room that smelled of ash and silence. The war was already lost. No convoys moved. No fuel arrived. The Imperial Navy, once the sword of the Emperor, had ceased to exist. Across the empire, rusting hulls littered the coasts. Destroyers half sunk at anchor, submarines grounded in harbors, carriers stripped for scrap. What had begun with Yamato's thunder ended in still water and empty skies. The last radio messages from sea captains were short, resigned, and often poetic. Engines stopped. The sea is calm. The men are waiting. Others ended with the word sayonara. It was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual collapse. For generations, Japan's Navy had seen itself as the embodiment of the nation's soul, disciplined, pure, invincible. But the ocean, which they had worshipped as protector, had become their executioner. At Imperial General Headquarters, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, last Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, faced the impossible. He had inherited a navy without ships, a command without command. When Emperor Hirohito asked about the state of the fleet, Toyoda replied simply, "We have nothing left to defend the homeland." Toyoda had once believed that spirit could compensate for material weakness, but now even spirit was exhausted. He saw it in the faces of the young sailors, boys of 17, their eyes hollow, their uniforms threadbare, their training reduced to memorizing prayers before missions that would never sail. The Imperial Navy had become a ghost army, thousands of men stationed on land, building fortifications for a fleet that no longer existed. In the cities, the collapse was total. By August 1945, Japan's fuel reserves were measured in days. Trains stopped, hospitals went dark, farmers plowed fields with oxen instead of engines. The once mighty industrial cities, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokohama, lay in ruins from American bombing. But it was the blockade beneath the waves that had broken their spine long before the bombs fell. Factories without coal, planes without fuel, ships without purpose. For the first time in its history, Japan was isolated. A fortress without supplies, a navy without sea. Among sailors and civilians alike, despair took root. Officers who had sworn never to surrender now faced a war that offered no battlefield to die upon. Many chose suicide, alone in their cabins or beside their sunken ships. Others simply vanished, walking into the sea. In diaries recovered after the war, one captain wrote, "We are not defeated by men, but by machines. We are not killed in battle, but erased, like footprints washed by the tide." That was the truth the Japanese Navy could never face. They had fought an enemy they could not see, in a war they could not understand. Beneath the code of Bushido, beneath the myth of invincibility, lay the simple arithmetic of modern war, and it had ruled against them. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, its shipping losses stood at merchant tonnage, 8.9 million tons sunk warships, 200 teeth, 15 destroyed oil tankers, nearly 90%, lost civilian casualties at sea, more than 30,000 UTC. Est. Submarines lost, 52, with 3,500 American sailors dead. The silent service, barely 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, had sunk over half of all Japanese ships lost in the war. Its total kills, measured not in glory but in absence, had strangled an empire. Japan's naval ensign, the rising sun flag, was lowered at sea for the last time. The wind carried its tattered edges across decks that no longer floated. The empire's dream of oceanic supremacy, born at Tsushima, baptized at Pearl Harbor, ended beneath the waves it once ruled. In war, the sea takes no sides. It remembers only the wreckage.